Okay, so in this session, we're going to talk about something which, when we go through it, I think seems really obvious, and yet auditors and organizations as a whole generally skip this part of separation of duties. Normally in separation of duties, we talk about separating transactions or separating transactions from the ability to handle master data. But this kind of third area is equally as important, which is transactions versus configurations. And that's configurations of the application itself, but also configurations around the area that the transaction also relates to. Mm-hmm. And so as we go through this, hopefully people watching this will sort of say, oh yeah, this is actually fairly obvious. But perhaps what we could do is talk about some examples of where within applications, organizations should be looking at certain configurations against certain transactions.
Yeah, it's a great topic, Lewis, and it is something that a lot of organizations miss in role design and kind of their ongoing SOD intensive access assessments. So I'll give you a couple of examples. One from IT that I would say, and I'll go through a couple of examples in some other areas of the application. So one in IT would be the ability to administer users. So do user provisioning, assignment of roles versus the setup of the role itself. So is that always separated in every organization? Not necessarily. You may have a very small group. The security administration team may make both the role changes and then administer users and assignment of those roles. But in the larger organizations, it's not the case. You may have a help desk user or somebody that does AD provisioning, or maybe auto provisioned, setting up users as part of like a integration of another product like SailPoint, for example. Yeah. So you may want to separate roles, and I do really believe that role changes to roles should be separate from the administration of users in any organization, primarily because the fact that if I am somebody that's doing a day-to-day administration of users, all I have to do to grant myself more access is change the role. Now, for sure, I can also add a role and then remove it, or like in ERP Cloud, you can remove the role, you can delete the role. But that may be one set of log files that somebody looks at versus the role changes, an addition of a role and a deletion of addition of a privilege and a removal of a privilege in a role, maybe a separate set of logs that somebody looks at, and those may be not looked at on a timely basis. So let's just say they only get reviewed once a year by the internal auditors as part of the external audit. Yeah. Then it may not be caught for 6 to 9 to 12 months later. So this concept of just separating administration of users, administrators of roles is a good example. So that's more of an ITGC example, IT general controls. The other big area of maturity that organizations struggle with is maturity in and around access to IT application controls. So IT application controls are things like journal approval workflow or purchase order approval workflow. Anything that's workflow driven is going to be configured in one place, and then that should be configured by the IT organization, and then transactions should be something that the end users end up doing. So some examples in the GL side would be like separating the entry of journals or posting of journals from the configuration of journal sources, or there's some specific journal approval configuration setups. Yeah. Or even auto post criteria, depending upon what your controls are in and around journal entries. It's a longer topic. Yeah. And so every area, the ability to enter invoices in AP, create, maintain invoices. There's configurations like invoice holds. What happens? Can somebody release a hold manually? As an example. So maintain invoice and release holds should be segregated for things like creating AP invoices, or even the ability to release AP holds. So yeah. And then a last example would be like the ability to do receiving transactions and receiving options, or purchase orders and purchase order configurations. Yeah.
Do you think there's ever circumstances amongst those where users should or could get away with having configurations and transactional access?
That's kind of an interesting question because what we would normally recommend is all the change, anything that should go through change control be managed by IT, but we don't always, I would say we don't always win that argument depending upon the organization. So if an end user is going to have the ability to make configurations, they should still go through the change control process because ultimately that change control process is driving testing, documentation, approvals.
Yeah.
But if you had a very strong IT compliance, if you had the audit logs, if you will, on all the configurations, and somebody was reviewing those logs on a regular basis to make sure things were going through the change control process on a proactive basis, the last thing you want in that scenario would be a change made, an internal audit or external auditor coming in as part of your SOX audit, and then identifying that a change that was made hadn't gone through the change control process.
Yeah.
That does not end well from an external audit perspective. So
yeah,
while we could put the right controls around, it's just really not normally advisable to try to take that risk.
Then the other issue is a lot of those IT users also have the ability to configure the audits or the auditing side as well, right? Switch it on and off. So who's watching the watchmen, so to speak?
Yeah, that's a good point. So we look at the configuration of audit policies in the ERP cloud as the audit log capabilities is really critical. And that really should be separate from, we would argue, from anybody that supports anything else in the system. Yeah. So if you have business analysts and other people that do day-to-day support, and maybe they have configurations, the logs for those configurations are going to be turned on in audit policies. So you could argue like the maintenance of audit policies really should be separated from all other things. Yeah. So you can either view that as an SOD risk in some respects, but you can also then kind of look at maybe audit policies as alone as its standalone sensitive access risk.
Yeah. Okay.